Don't go anywhere. On the way, we'll have a look at this morning's papers with the broadcaster, barrister and futurist, Andrew Eborn.
Times Radio Breakfast.
Times Radio Early Breakfast.
Good morning, good to have your company. It is 5:17 now. James Hanson here with you between now and 6. And remember to tune in tomorrow to Times Radio, where at midday, it's PMQ's Keir Starmer's first as Prime Minister, and also Rishi Sunak's first as the Leader of the Opposition. Slightly weird role reversal. You can hear it live on Times Radio with Matt Chorley and Tim Shipman, where they will give it their unique treatment, pausing the action to analyse the exchanges in real time. It's PMQ's Unpacked, exclusively here on Times Radio tomorrow at midday. Right, let's have a look at the front pages of today's papers, beginning with the Times. Donor dollars pour in as Harris promises victory is the headline. Democrats unite behind Biden's pick for president. Together, we're going to win this, she says. Front of the Daily Telegraph, coronation for Harris as rivals step aside. Vice President likely to pick white man as running mate to win over blue-collar voters. It will be fascinating to see who she chooses as her running mate. My money is on Josh Shapiro, who's the governor of Pennsylvania, because, of course, Pennsylvania is one of the key swing states, the key battleground states. I mean, there aren't that many these days, states that are properly swing states that could go either way. And Pennsylvania, of course, was won by Donald Trump in 2016, was won by Joe Biden last time. If the Democrats are going to win in November, you would have thought they're going to need Pennsylvania. So if you choose the relatively popular incumbent governor of Pennsylvania, you'd assume that would help. Front of The Guardian, senior Democrats throw weight behind Harris to take on Trump. The FT go with Harris close to sealing nomination as Democratic grandees add support. Front of the Eye this morning, big photo of Kamala Harris. The Anointed is their headline. Surge in donations and support for Kamala Harris in Democrats' quest to stop Trump. And the Daily Express this morning, Farage, more Tory MPs will soon defect to reform. Well, joining me to have a further look at today's papers is the broadcaster, barrister and futurist, Andrew Eborn. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning, James. Always a joy to join you.
Yeah, thank you for coming on the programme. Let's begin with the big story of the moment, which is, of course, Kamala Harris as the... You could almost call her now the presumptive Democratic nominee. She will need to be officially nominated, of course, at the DNC in Chicago in a few weeks' time. But it looks pretty inevitable now that she will replace Joe Biden at the top of the ticket. Do you think she can beat Donald Trump, though?
Oh, no, absolutely not. But what the absolute joy, however, is if elected, which she won't be, she will be the first woman, first African-American, first Asian-American president in the history of the United States. But what people do, and it was all terribly predictable. I did say that sleepy Joe Biden, I had a little competition about, you remember Liz Truss and the lettuce? Well, I was doing a competition about Joe Biden and his presidential campaign, whether that would survive against an orange. Obviously, any resemblance to any future past or president was purely coincidental. And the orange was the one that survived and didn't run out of juice. Joe Biden ran out of juice first. And it was all terribly predictable. What was extraordinary, James, was that it all happened incredibly quickly. Because within a matter of hours, Joe Biden said, no, I'm going to run. A man who looked least like running anyone I've ever seen. Basically all turned around. So the things behind the scenes and what goes on here is quite extraordinary. But I'll tell you what's going to happen. I think your prediction about a running mate is probably right, because that's the way they do these things. But Kamala Harris, in all her glorious quotes, apart from her pop at Donald with her speech, which your brilliant producer managed to do in the cut down in get the core quote within a matter of seconds. Kamala Harris, unburdened, that's the word she keeps on using. And a lot of people sort of dig out these old quotes of her. Kamala Harris is unburdened by competency, is what they say. What can be unburdened by what has been, is one of her glorious quotes. Another thing which is doing the rounds is, you think you just fell out of a coconut tree. Well, there you go. So all of these things, you get Biden and his blunders, they're going to be digging out loads of hers. But in answer to your question, I think the extraordinary events in America over the last few days, including the appalling assassination attempt on Donald Trump, has almost guaranteed him the presidency. Couple that with J.D. Vance, which sounds like a cheaper sportswear store, doesn't it? J.D. Vance is his running mate. make, which, dealing with your point earlier, James, about that's what you do. You try and work out where are these particular states. And he's got Ohio there. He was the wonderful stuff on Hillbilly Elegy. He wrote that glorious thing in 2019. But his was a road to Damascus moment, because he was an anti-Trumper. He was a never-Trumper, if you remember what he was sort of saying on that sort of premise. And he was sort of turning around, he called a potential American Hitler. Terrible rhetoric in 2016. But he was asked by the press about all those quotes from 2016. He said, well, at that stage, that's what I thought. But Donald then became the best president we've ever had, and I changed my mind. And what I also realised is the media are going to blame them. They all lied about Donald. He's a great guy. So I think that's what's going to happen. We're going to have this road to Damascus moment. Lots of people who are maybe not supporting beforehand will rally around Kamala, but my money is still on the Donald.
That's really interesting that you're so certain that Donald Trump will be the next president. I mean, I know what you mean. There was definitely a sense last week, the Republicans had a very successful convention in Milwaukee, and off the back of that awful assassination attempt against him, there was a sense that maybe he had momentum on his side. But I think David Axelrod, the former advisor to President Obama, has a great quote, which is, in American politics, the conventional wisdom is always wrong. And just as people are assuming that Donald Trump is on course for victory, well, maybe he's not. I mean, if it was against Joe Biden, then yes, probably. But, does Kamala Harris, for all her flaws as a candidate, not present a far more credible opponent?
Well, I think it is interesting, and people have thrown in Michelle Obama, even though she hasn't even put her own name in there. And what I love is one particular paper is saying there's an asparagus psychic, whatever that is.
Yeah, the Daily Star this morning says they've got their asparagus psychic who reckons it's going to be Michelle Obama, not Kamala Harris.
Well, I think that's what you have to rely on. The times that we rely on asparagus psychics, I think that's glorious. But I was one of the very few people in the world who predicted Donald Trump the first time around. They all dismissed him. And you might remember people went to bed saying, oh, Hillary's won. And in the morning, here's Donald. To everybody's surprise. And I said he would not only get the nomination, but he would run and he would win. And indeed he did. So my money is, and I predicted this a long time ago, actually, right here on this very station, that Donald will be the next guy. I think what's happening is they're all rallying around for the next time around in 4 years' time, which is extraordinary. What's interesting as well, though, James, is that if J.D. Vance does become the vice president, if Donald wins, and then Donald steps aside, a lot of ifs in this, he steps aside within a couple of years, then J.D. Vance, who's only 39, would then become the youngest president ever. Because the youngest one before that was Teddy Roosevelt, who was 42, and J.D. Vance, as I say, is 39 at the moment. So lots of ifs in there, but I say watch this space.
I would say the biggest if in there is getting Donald Trump to step aside before the end of his term. I mean, if you think Joe Biden was hard to budge, can you imagine Donald Trump, the man who did everything in his power not to leave the White House last time around? I don't think he's leaving voluntarily before the end of his term, but we shall see.
I think you're right.
Let's talk about the story on the front of the Express this morning. Farage, more Tory MPs will soon defect to reform, and there is a suggestion that Suella Braverman, the former Home Secretary, could even be among them. I mean, we were talking a bit earlier on about the Tory leadership rules, and we expect nominations to open this week. Suella Braverman has really dropped down the bookies' the bookmakers' odds. 6 months ago, she was one of the favourites to be the next Tory leader. Now she's really not. I think she's as far as 40-1 with some bookmakers. Is that because she's burnt her bridges in the Conservative Party?
I think she's burnt all sorts of things. And I think what I find extraordinary, I know Nigel very well, shared many a studio, the reality is that when you look at the election result, and I did predict Starmageddon, and there it was, I also predicted that actually there will be 72 seats for the Liberal Democrats, who got 12% of the votes. You then turn around and say, well, hang about, what about Reform? Well, Reform got 14% of the votes, significantly more, but only ended up with 5 seats. So Liberal Democrats get 72 on 12%. But Reform get just 5 on 14. Democracy, I think a lot of people are going to get very grumpy about the fact that they voted for particular parties and they didn't get in. I think Starmer's going to have a very short honeymoon period. People always elect parties and they hope that things will change. There's been all sorts of promises, but I think people will be disappointed, difficult to deliver. So what's going to happen? I think Reform, absolutely. And there's been people touting that Nigel may turn around and be the American ambassador, especially as he has a very special relationship, very special indeed, with Donald. And so if Donald gets in, as I predict, then Nigel would be a perfect ambassador to make that happen. But I do think Suella Braverman, as you say, she's gone through that sort of stage where she's not nearly as popular as she was. And Nigel, with his welcoming arms, may indeed welcome her.
Yes, and whether there are more Conservative defections, obviously they had Lee Anderson in the last Parliament, will be really interesting. Let's do one more story, Andrew. This is a great story. Inside the Times today, whiff of human stress makes dogs more pessimistic. I say it's a great story. I mean, it's not a great story in the sense that you don't want to have dogs that are a bit miserable because humans are miserable, but it does pick up on the fact that kind of something that I think in a way, when you think about it, does make sense. Anyone who's ever had a dog knows that their mood and your mood is very often intertwined.
Oh, dogs are absolutely incredible. Apart from being support pets and things like that, they can sniff out diseases and so on and so forth. A friend of mine runs a company called Wagtail, who basically they can do things like recruiting, smelling, not only just smelling for illegal substances, but they can do all sorts of things about immigration and also finding bats when they need to be saved, and newts and things like that. What this was an extraordinary story. 18 pairs of pet dogs were trained, and they basically had a food bowl where one location had a treat in it and one would be empty, and they would always go to the full one. What they did is between those bowls, they put an indifferent bowl, which was sometimes full of food and sometimes not. And what would happen is the dogs would, whether they were going to be pessimistic or optimistic, was measured by how quickly they went to this random bowl in between. An extraordinary experiment. I'd love to see all of that. And so what they did, they worked out, they got the people to do, first of all, to make them depressed, they made them all do a maths test, because that made people depressed. And to make them all happy, they listened to music or listened to the Times Radio early breakfast show.
Oh, you're on message. You're on message.
And that's what they did. So they made them optimistic. And that's how they measure the dogs. And basically this middle bowl, this indifferent bowl, which may or may not contain food, they worked out that when the person was sweaty and a bit depressed because they did a maths test, the dogs were equally depressed and approached the bowl sort of pessimistically and assuming there was going to be no food there. But when they listened to Times Radio, early breakfast in the morning, the dogs were equally excited and ran to the bowl. And that was their test, very scientific, based on 18 dogs.
Very good. I mean, it's fascinating because it is sort of backing up what I think any dog owner will kind of know intuitively, which is that, dogs are incredibly emotionally intelligent, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. And this is why pets, and when people lose a pet, and we've all been there, it's like losing a member of the family because they know your moods. They're more supportive than anybody. And on that sort of basis, I totally get it. It's a fascinating study. 18 dogs with their dog bowls is interesting. And they had Dr. Nicola Rooney, is a lecturer in wildlife and conservation. And she's the lead author of this particular paper, said, understanding how human stress affects dogs' well-being is an important consideration when training companion dogs and dogs for working roles such as assistants. And it's all in there in the scientific report, so it must be true.
Andrew, always great to chat. Thank you so much.
It's a real pleasure, James. You take care.
That's the broadcaster, barrister and futurist Andrew Eborn there.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.